Dogworks Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dogworks. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com.
Start your day tomorrow with The Daily Dog with Michelle Forto, the morning podcast on Dogworks Radio. Apple Podcast reviewer Patty Christensen calls it funny, smart, and filled with all the info I want to know about dogs. I love this show. Wake up with The Daily Dog. Available on Dogworks Radio on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your shows.
Radio Free Palmer 89.5 KVRF presents Mushing Radio, hosted by Robert Forto. Mushing Radio is about dog-powered sports, living in the Great White North, and mushing. Visit our website at mushingradio.com. Here is your host, Robert Forto.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Robert Forto, and you're listening to Mushing Radio here on KVRF 89.7 in the Matsu Valley. We are at radiofreepalmer.org is our live streaming site, and you can hear us over on dogworksradio.com. Make sure you check us out on social media, just searching for Dogworks Radio, and calling in is our co-host, Alex Stein. Alex, how's it going?
It's going great, Robert. I know that we've had a lot of requests for some information and people asking some basic questions. So what we're going to do today is we're going to just cover some of those questions that people had that sometimes we who've been exposed to the sport a lot, or we who know about it a lot, just assume everyone knows about this. But it's good every once in a while to take a step back and cover some of these basic issues.
Yes, we are going to talk about some of the gear that we use with the dogs and on the sled in races and also in training. Is that right?
Yeah, and one of the questions that people asked recently was, what's the deal with these booties? So booties are basically these coverings that go over the paws of the dogs, and that's something that's been around for a while, but people who are new to the sport might suddenly look at these dog team and say, why do these dogs seem to be wearing socks?
Right. Booties are an essential piece of gear for sled dogs, and most mushers will start every race with every dog wearing a pair of booties. And the reason that they do is they are designed, just like our own shoes, to protect their feet on different racing conditions, whether it be soft snow or pebbled snow or even ice. And we put these booties on because we do not know what's happening, in the next sections of the trail. So we always are cautious with that. And a bootie is very simply a piece of fabric with a Velcro strap around the top, and the fabric it can often be associated with what your backpack would be made out of, and then, like I said, the Velcro wraps around the top and then on the feet. And then a lot of mushers also go a step further, and they add some type of powder in the booties, and that way it keeps everything dry inside, and it keeps the foot from exposing itself to any other damage.
Do you know when people started using booties? I know it's very, everyone uses them now, but I'm wondering when this practice really got big.
I have seen pictures that they were using things like leather and fleece booties way back into the 60s. So I guess it was not as a common practice as it is today, but even back then, they were conscious of what could happen to their dog's feet.
Right. And as we've progressed with different types of fabrics for clothing and for protection, I imagine that the types of fabrics used in the booties has changed and is now more high tech than it was, say, 20 years ago.
Ever since I've been mushing, and I've been doing it since 1994, they've stayed with pretty much the same fabric. It's called Cordura, and as I mentioned, it's sort of like what you would have on your backpack. And they have different thicknesses of that depending on the bootie manufacturer. But what's interesting to note, Alex, is each one of these booties cost about $1. And for Iditarod, you're going through potentially 1,000, 1,500 of these. So it is a big expense for any race.
Right. And people who are gathered along the trails, especially the ceremonial start in Iditarod, a lot of the mushers will throw out will throw booties to the crowds who are gathered to watch them. Um, and in some cases, if you're around the trail, you can find booties that have been worn by dogs that have come off for some reason. And when I first went up to Iditarod, I found a booty from a dog team that had just passed by, and I took it back with me, and it, as you might imagine, smelled like a wet dog, and I had to put it in a special plastic bag. And then when I brought it home, my wife said, "Yeah, you're going to keep that in the plastic bag."
Right. You know, a booty is one of those coveted souvenirs for a lot of mushing fans. It's very similar to that game-worn jersey for your favorite athlete or sports team. People really, really like to have those as souvenirs.
Now, we've heard the term hook or snow hook used a lot, as in setting the hook or pulling the hook. What exactly is that, and how does that work?
Almost every dog sled in distance mushing will use two snow hooks, typically one that is larger than the other, and they are used as it as implies. It is the hook that holds down the team. They're typically made out of steel or aluminum, and they have very sharp hooks on the ends of them so they can dig into the snow and ice to hold back your team. So if you guys think about stopping a dog team on the snow, you have to have a way to hold them there while you get off and feed them snacks or take care of them or move them around or whatever. So a hook is tied onto a rope, and then that rope is attached at some point to the gang line and the bridle, so it becomes one with the sled, and that is what you use to hold that team back. And it's a dangerous piece of equipment. I don't know how many new mushers I have seen where they have had that hook fly off of the sled, and they've either crashed or whatever, and that hook has snared them in some way, whether it's popped them in the head or into the thigh or whatever. They are very sharp, and they need to be, because they need to be able to hold back a 10, 12, 14, or 16 dog team with as much effort as possible.
And if you think about it, that to have something that can go into the snow or into the ice and still be sturdy enough to, as you said, to hold back a team of 12 or 14 dogs, that's got to be pretty substantial.
It is substantial. The ones that I use on my main sled, I have used for more than 15 years, and they still are working like they did before. They do not bend, they do not crease, they don't do anything like you would think something made out of aluminum would. They are very sturdy and very compact.
And I would think that the aluminum ones, anyway, are relatively lightweight, or are they not?
I would say they are a couple of pounds. I know the steel ones are a little bit heavier, especially the really hefty ones. My daughter received one for running junior Iditarod, and that thing there, I think, could hold back an elephant if it had to. It is a very substantial hook.
Let's move on to cookers. We hear a lot of discussion about cookers. It's a required item on Iditarod and many other sled dog races. What are the cookers that mushers are required to have?
Well, there are several different types of cookers, but the most common is very similar to a steel 5-gallon bucket like you would see at Home Depot or Lowe's or something like that. It's sort of two of those put together, and it has some type of holder or cooking element at the bottom, and we use a product called Heat, Heet. It's actually a product that removes water from gasoline and diesel car engines. So we use that heat to pretty much all the cooker is designed for is to boil water for the dogs. And on the trail, especially in long distance mushing, you often have to melt snow to get this water so you can add it to your kibble and your meat for the dog food. So it is a very rapid system that boils water. It has, so if you think about it, it has a 5-gallon bucket with the cooking element inside, and then some type of pot. And we use just an aluminum pot like you would cook spaghetti in at your house, one of those large aluminum type containers. And then we fill that with water, and then we add that water to our dog food. as we prepare the meals for the dogs on the trail.
How long does it take for the water to boil in a cooker usually?
Well, if you're melting snow, it takes probably about 45 minutes, but you have to continue to add snow. As many people know, the volume of snow does not equal the same amount of water, so you're constantly adding snow to the pot. If you have a normal temperature water, and I say normal because remember some of these checkpoints are in the very negative temperature, so the water is going to be near freezing already. It would take considerably bit longer, and then we aren't looking for a full rolling boil like you would use if you're making pasta or something at home. We're just looking for very hot water so we can use that to add to the frozen meat and kibble.
Now, I am frequently confused about the various lines that are associated with sled dogs. The neck lines, the toe lines, the gang lines. Can you just go over what the various terms are for the various ropes and lines associated with a sled dog team?
Yes, the lines that run down the middle in between the dogs are what are called gang lines or gang line sections, and those can be anywhere between 6 and 9 feet in length. And if you think about it, that is where the dog is where the dogs are in the middle of. And then each one of those gangline sections are looped together and strung out to get the length of your dog team. So if you have a 10-dog team, you will have 4 gangline sections in the leader section. And with this gangline, you also have 2 other components. You will have a tug line system, and each dog has a tug line, and that is what is attached to the harness at the back of the dog. And then most people these days run necklines, so that's at the front of the gangline section, and that loops through the gangline and attaches to the dog's collar. So if you think about it, the dog is attached in 2 points to each section of the gangline. So the gangline is then attached to some type of bungee system or some type of shock cord or something like that, which attaches to the sled. And then, as I mentioned, it is strung out in front of the sled in 8 or 6 or 8 or 9 foot sections. So if you have a 10-dog team, that would be approximately 24 feet in front of the sled, not including the length of the lead dogs.
And is the lead dog line, is that longer than the regular gang line sections?
What we do is we just use 2 tug lines that are attached to the end of that last section of gang line, so we don't have different lengths for those dogs, and then they are attached together by 1 neckline, so it will have 2 snaps on the end of that leader neckline, which attaches the 2 dogs together.
Right. And just so that we're clear about this, the reason that it's 24 feet instead of 48 is that usually at each position there will be 2 dogs. So there will be a dog on the right and a dog on the left. And many times people will also run 2 dogs in lead, although sometimes there will be a single dog running in lead.
Right, and of course, some people spread their dogs out. They will have single dogs running by themselves on the line. So let's say that they're running 9 dogs. They will have typically 2 wheel dogs, and I know we're going to talk about dog positions in a different episode, but they'll have 2 wheel dogs, then maybe a single dog in team, and then they'll have a couple of more dogs in swing, which is the next position, and then of course a couple of dogs in wheel. And often when you have to drop a dog or remove a dog, you will take those extra tugs and extra necklines that are left by removing the other dog and attach it to the dog that is next to it, so that those of course those lines are not dragging along on the trail on the gang line.
Right. And you mentioned harnesses and collars. Can you talk a little bit about what types of harnesses are used in sled dog racing, and if it's similar to the harnesses that we see on house pet dogs that are taken out to the park, or if it's a particular specialty type of harness?
Yeah, there are really three different types of harnesses. Probably the most common harness, which has been around for years, I think it's a very similar type harness to what they were using even back in the the early days, including maybe even the Serum Run. It's called an X-back harness, and the reason being is the straps of the harness, which is a webbing material with some type of padding, forms an X over the back of the dog. And then the other type of harness is an H-back harness, which is very similar to the X-back, but instead of it forming an X, it will form an H, so we'll have just one strap over their back. And then what are becoming even more common these days are what are called shorty type harnesses, and that looks very similar to what you may see on a dog, walking down the street or whatever. It rides very close to just the rib cage, so it's a very short type harness, and then it is attached to the sled, sort of at the rib cage versus at the back of the dog. And then the collars, also the same type of webbing is used in the harnesses. It's typically an adjustable collar, but it does not have any type of clasp. We do not want to have a dog running down the trail where a plastic clasp or something could break. So it's a one-piece type collar, and then often they will have a very large ring on the collar, and that is used not only to hook the dogs up to the necklines, but it's also a place where you'll often find mushers holding on to their dogs. And if folks are really keen to the sport of mushing, you'll often see mushers walking their dogs to the line or back to the truck or whatever, and typically the dogs are sort of bunny hopping down the trail because they're being held up by that ring, so they just sort of hop, 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 hop as they're working their way. It's a very efficient way to get a dog from one place to the other.
Is there a difference in terms of the different types of harnesses for how much power you get out of each different type of harness, each different design, the H versus the X, for example? Or is it more dependent on the size of the dog, or is it just a preference thing for the musher?
I believe it's more of a preference thing. I have used X-back harnesses exclusively in the last 25 years or so in my mushing career. It's just what works for me. And then of course they're interchangeable. So if it works for one dog and that dog is the same size, you can use that on a different dog. And of course they come in a wide variety of sizes, all the way from small to extra large, depending on your dogs, and that's just what's common for me. I know there are many mushers today that do use those shorty type harnesses. I believe it was Jeff King that started to use those harnesses, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or so, and he's of course had excellent success with those, and many mushers after him have used those as well. But what's interesting, Alex, if a person uses those X-back harnesses or H-back harnesses and or those shorty type harnesses, it is an entirely different hookup system for the dogs on the line. So you cannot necessarily have a dog that typically wears a shorty harness and then one that wears an X harness and be able to switch them around quickly in positions in the team.
Do the dogs have any preference for which type of harness they use, or are they just fine however they're strapped in?
Well, I do find dogs that use the different types of harnesses. Size is, of course, very important, because then you have to worry about rub and fit and all that sort of stuff. Thinking about wearing a climbing harness or even a backpack or anything like that, if it doesn't fit correctly, it becomes pretty painful pretty quickly. So you want to make sure that it has a very good fit. But I haven't found any of my dogs that prefer one over the other. But again, I've used the same ones for my entire career. But again, I think different breeds of dogs are more common in one type of harness or another. I know a lot of the houndier type dogs are typically using those shorter type harnesses because, their chest is different and, their entire physical makeup is much different than what a typical sled dog, what people think about that husky looking dog, looks like.
Right. And a lot of races, I think most races, require that mushers carry an axe. Can you talk about what type of axe that is? They're usually, I think, very small axes. They're not like what we might think of as an axe that you would take out to your wood pile to chop wood with.
Right. This is typically a camp axe. I think it has to be 20 ounces, if I'm correct, and I think it has to be 26 inches long, and I may be miscorrect on that information, but yeah, it's typically more of a camp axe. It's not one of those big burly type axes that you would use to split a cord of wood, but it is a required piece of equipment, a mandatory piece of equipment on most long distance mushing races and events, and it's used because you have to be able to clear the trail if necessary from fallen trees or any type of debris, but it's also very handy on rivers and lakes and that sort of thing. If you cannot set one of those snow hooks that we talked about, if we cannot get a good grip with that, you may have to use that axe to cut through some of that ice to be able to get that hook in. And what I found interesting, I was reading about this just yesterday about the Yukon Quest, is I guess back in the day, a musher had to kill a moose with the axe because most mushers do not, or they're not allowed to carry firearms when they cross the border from Alaska to Canada or back and forth. So they had to figure out a way to get rid of that moose, and I guess they used their axe. That could be an urban legend. I can only imagine trying to kill a couple of 1,000-pound moose with a little camp axe.
Yeah, and it used to be that we don't hear these stories all that much anymore. But back when people used to do a lot more camping and not staying in or near checkpoints or in cabins, we used to hear a lot about people would use their axes to chop down, I guess not chop down trees, but chop down branches to make fires with them. And I guess that it would be very useful for that as well.
Yeah, and again, that's why it is a mandatory piece of equipment. I don't know how many years or trips over the years I've had to get out my axe to cut down a tree that had fallen over the trail. And of course, you can't get your dog team over, and here in Alaska, we don't have these massive trees like most people would expect to find in the wilderness. Our trees are relatively small in diameter, so they're pretty easy to cut down, especially the spruce trees. And I've cut down, or at least removed, pieces of trees many times with that axe, and it's still a pretty hefty workout, especially if you have a 14-dog team banging in their harnesses behind you, ready to go, and they'll do their best to try to get over that tree, whether it's there or not.
Right, and back in the day, there used to be a lot of mushers would have to go ahead and break their own trail, especially when there was fresh snow. That's less the case with a lot of modern races, but I know that most long distance races, including Iditarod, still require mushers to carry snowshoes.
Yes, and if you ask 10 mushers, I bet you would hear from 8 of them that say they have never used their snowshoes just because of how trails are maintained and groomed today. I've used my snowshoes on very rare occasions. You will find many mushers that have their snowshoes permanently attached to their sled using zip ties or something like that, but it is a mandatory piece of gear in case you do have to break trail. And I know that there's also a size requirement for snowshoes, and snowshoes are sized very similar to how skis are sized. I think they do it in centimeters or something like that, like they have to have 75 centimeters or something like that for your snowshoes on a mandatory piece of gear. And of course, there are some really romantic type mushers out there that will have the really fancy hand woven with the sinew and the wood, the old school, what most people think about when they think about what snowshoes look like. I know Martin Booser carried a pair of those a few years ago on Iditarod, but those are pretty impractical to carry nowadays with the ultralight gear and sleds that people are trying to use to get down the trail. You don't want something that is overly heavy just because it looks cool.
Right. Even though some of the hand woven native snowshoes are just absolutely gorgeous and beautiful to look at. But as you said, you have them there for a practical use, not just because they're pretty. Let's talk about sled bags. I know that when you look at a sled is basically a pretty bare bones skeleton made out of wood. But then you add the sled bag, and that sort of turns it into what I think most people think of as a sled.
Right, and sleds are made out of all types of materials these days. Again, most of the sleds that people think of are those wooden type sleds, but nowadays they're made out of aluminum and carbon fiber and all hockey sticks and all sorts of stuff. So yeah, we're going to talk about sleds in a different episode, but yes, a sled bag is also a required piece of equipment, and the reason it is required is it has to have the ability to hold a dog securely in the bag, and that means either being able to zip it up fully so it is fully contained, or as you will see on a lot of pictures of mushing, if a person is carrying a dog, the dog's head will be sticking out of the top of the bag, and it's attached somehow to the sled, typically with a neckline. But that sled bag has to be able to hold that dog if a dog becomes injured or it needs to drop or it needs to rest or whatever. But most commonly, what is in that bag is everything that we've talked about. It's the cooker and the cooler and the axe and a sleeping bag and booties and food and all of that other stuff that you would carry in your bag, very similar to how you would carry it in your backpack. All of that gear is dog-related gear. And the sled bag is typically made out of that same Cordura type material that the booties are made out of, but a much thicker, stronger type material. This is more common to what a backpack would be made out of, and it stretches from the brush bow, which is in the front of the sled, all the way back to the driving bow, and it's attached with Velcro or straps of some form or fashion, and then it has a couple of zippers and whatnot to be able to zip it up fully. And what's interesting about this, Alex, is often you will see smaller little compartments on these sled bags, and almost always that's the only amount of space that a musher has on the sled, and that's where the musher keeps his snacks or his headlamp or his extra pair of gloves or whatever. So our gear is compacted into something about the size of a fanny pack, or maybe even a little larger, compared to the very large sled bag which carries all the gear and materials for the dogs.
Right. And you want to make sure that the things that you're going to need most often will be available and sort of near the top or very accessible, so that you don't spend, 20 or 25 minutes taking everything out and searching for something that's way at the bottom. So I've seen some sled bags will have like little compartments for the musher to hold, for example, the vet book, which is required. It has to be signed in Iditarod. It has to be signed, I believe, at every checkpoint. Where you can also get some little snacks, maybe batteries for your headlamp you might want to keep there as well. It's very important that these things be accessible, especially the things that you're going to need all the time.
Right, for sure. You don't want to have those batteries at the bottom of the bag at the front of the sled, and then all of a sudden it becomes dark and you find out that your headlamp batteries are dead, and you're sitting there on the side of the trail trying to dig through a very full bag in the dark, and you're unable to find those extra set of batteries.
Yeah, and a lot of the things that you've talked about today are items that maybe are not used all that often, or that in the case of snowshoes, some mushers will go many, many years or their entire career without using them. But I think the point about a lot of this equipment is that it is essential safety equipment. And hopefully 95% of the time, you're not going to need snowshoes and you're not going to need some of this stuff. But you're out in the middle of nowhere, and it can be a very long way for help to get to you. So even today in the world of, the GPS trackers and the emergency locator beams and stuff like that, a lot of this equipment and a lot of the stuff that mushers are required to carry is designed so that if everything goes wrong, they will still be able to stay safe.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And just to compare and contrast a little bit. We always leave the sprint mushers out of our shows, and I want to be able to be inclusive to them. They will have pretty much all of the gear that we talked about: the gang lines, the tug lines, the neck lines, the snow hooks, the sled bag, the booties, all of that. They will have everything that we use in distance mushing, with the exception of those snowshoes, those cookers, those axes, all of that stuff. Of course, they're running a much lighter, faster sled, and they don't have pretty much anything in their sled bag. They're hooking their dogs up, and pretty much they're just hanging on.
Right. Did we talk about snub lines?
Snub lines is one piece of equipment that some mushers use and others don't. Typically, they're used, in particular, they're used for less experienced mushers that will use them sort of as an, oh my goodness line, I've almost lost the team, and they'll have it dragging behind the sled so they can grab onto it. That's a pretty uncommon thing that you will see in a racing environment today. A lot of junior mushers use something like that. But another use of a snub line is a tie-off line. It's used to tie off your sled to a tree or to your dog truck or to a snow machine or something of the effect before you get ready to go out on your run. It keeps the dog team secure while you're hooking them up or, having to bed them down as a sort of emergency procedure. You will tie up your sled to a tree in the woods. That way, if that snow hook happened to pop, the dog team cannot take off without you. So that's another reason why you would use a snub line. I have one on our sled because we tie off in our yard to a pole, so because we're constantly hooking the dog teams up as a group. So if my wife and I are hooking up the dogs, both she and I are running through the yard to hook the dog teams up, and we want to make sure that the sled doesn't pop before we get all the dogs hooked. So we'll tie them to that pole, and then of course as we get ready to leave, we'll untie that knot, wrap it around one of the stanchions of the sled, and be able to take off from there.
Excellent. I believe we are running out of time.
Yes, we are out of time, and I hope to have a couple of more episodes like this. I know a lot of people have been asking on social media. I get asked these questions all the time, especially from people that are brand new to the sport and come out to our place and are just learning how to become mushers. They always ask, what is this for, or how is this used? So now we have a place to point them. So I appreciate the time today, Alex, and we'll talk again soon, okay?
Yes, this has been very helpful, not only for me as sort of a review, but hopefully for all of our fans who've heard these terms a lot, but maybe aren't exactly clear on what they are.
Very good. We'll talk to you guys next time. Goodbye.
Did you know that Alaska Dog Works trains service dogs for those in need throughout North America? Each and every service dog that is trained through the Lead Dog Service Dog Program and Michelle Forto and her team has an individual training plan. We train for autistic, mobility, psychiatric, and PTSD for our soldiers for service work. If you know of someone that may need a service dog, please take a moment and check out Alaska Dog Works on social media and at alaskadogworks.com.
Hi guys, it's Alex. If you're a fan of sled dog sports and the Iditarod, Mushing Radio is the show for you. Each Wednesday we drop a new episode on Dogworks Radio, so be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from.
If you like our podcast, there are a few things you can do. You can take a couple of minutes and go to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review. You can also check out all of our Dogworks Radio sponsors and promotions in our show notes. Another thing you can do is go over to Facebook, like our Facebook page, and one last thing, please tell all of your friends by spreading the word about Dogworks Radio. Thank you so much for listening to us. We really appreciate you.
Dogworks Radio is produced by Robert Forto. Logo art by Angry Squirrel Studios. Dogworks Radio is produced in conjunction with KVRF 89.7 in Palmer, Alaska.
For dog training advice, you can contact Alaska Dog Works at 907-841-1234. 1686 or visit their website at alaskadogworks.com. If you have a show idea or would like to be a guest, please contact us by sending an email to live@dogworksradio.com.